Good morning. We're back again today, trying to make our day bright, and yours too. We're reading stories that have previously been published in Slidell magazine. Today we're going to read a story titled Homemade Ice Cream. Now remember, I wrote this story, but I'm not a reader, so if I kind of stumble on some words, we don't have editing equipment. So you're just going to have to believe that's part of the story. Because if I was telling you that, I would stumble my words also. Homemade ice cream. Yes, today I went back to the old home place again, to visit the memories that I love so, to look again at the old house that's falling down, where I grew up so many years ago. Melvin. In the South, we have lots of old sayings. For example, rain before 7, fair before 11. Farmers and laborers would plan their day's work based on that bit of wisdom. There was also one that said, Southern ladies don't sweat, they just perspire. I know this one's not true because my grandmother was definitely a Southern lady and she did sweat. Numerous times during the day I would see her wipe the perspiration from her face with her apron. She wore an apron almost all day. It had been spotless white when she started her day at 5 a.m. in the morning, but by mid-morning it was stained with the bits of good things that were happening in her kitchen. For years she sweated in the kitchen of her home in South Mississippi over a wood stove. The temperatures in her kitchen in that pre-air conditioning era and a breezeless summer day might well have been over 100 degrees. She cooked 3 meals a day for a large family, various homeless relatives, field hands, and more often than not, at least one traveling evangelist. After cooking a large breakfast, she would then start lunch. Dinner's what she called it. Typically, she would have at least 3 meats. Fried chicken was always one. 4 fresh vegetables, 2 kinds of cornbread, and toast. We grandchildren called her Mama. By the early 1950s, nothing had changed except the children were gone. They were replaced by grandchildren, and the wood stove was replaced with a butane range. Not much improvement. In my lifetime, she would rest in the swing on the front porch after lunch until time to start supper. That was the evening meal. This had not always been the case, as in the earlier years, the afternoon was filled with canning, gardening, and cleaning with heavy housework. I suppose the swing that she rested in was her reward for getting older. One of the few breaks she got from this routine was on the 4th of July. On this day, all the relatives were expected to come back home as requested by my grandfather, Papa. Each of his children responded as if it were a command performance, and they were summoned by royalty. Relatives came from Jackson, Brookhaven, and farther out in the county, if you can get any farther out in the county. They also came from Texas. We call those the Texas bunch. If the truth be known, Mama worked just as hard on the 4th of July as on any other day. But she was assisted by her daughters and daughters-in-law. This made the day for her a joy rather than a burden, and she looked forward to this day as much, if not more, than any other holiday. Celebrating the 4th of July was not a big occasion for many Southerners, as that day had marked the fall of Vicksburg. Even in the 1950s, the war was not over for some on Route 2, Box 8. But at that address on the 4th of July, at this time, it was time for a celebration. It was also the day that Papa brought from his garden his first watermelons. He had planted and cared for them just for this occasion. He was aging too, and there was not as many as in past years, but plenty to provide a summer treat for his family and an occasional friend of the family who just might stop by. It was also the only day of the year that we made homemade ice cream. This was a ceremony that took place under the large magnolia tree on the south side of the big house. I think the Texas bunch was responsible for the ice cream, or at least they were in my childhood. The patriarch of the Texas bunch was my Uncle Big Pop. He was accompanied by his wife and 4 children, ranging in age from about 17 to 9 years old. I was 5 or 6 at the time. Big Pop was a favorite uncle to his nieces and nephews. He could have been a favorite because he only came once a year, and he always had wild stories about armadillos and other things happening in that foreign country of Texas. He also was in charge of the ice cream making. After dinner, he would load us kids in the car and go to the store to buy a block of ice. It was kept in a small building just outside Pistol Sasser's store. Just going in there was an experience. Well, Pistol and the store were also an experience, but that's another story. He would return to my grandparents' home, and Big Pop would put the ice in a burlap sack and crush it with the flat side of a single blade axe. It would explode inside the bag into pieces of various sizes and shapes, and some would be very sharp, so sharp they would actually cut through the sack. While this was taking place, Mama would return to the kitchen and prepare the mixture, which, in addition to fresh cream from the only cow they now owned, would have a large number of eggs that had been gathered just that very morning for the occasion. Again, in the hot kitchen, she would stir and watch the mixture until it was just the right consistency, and then set it aside to cool. No one helped her with this, as she's the only one who knew the just right consistency. It was her secret. In the meantime, Papa always instructed all his kids on how to tell the best ripe watermelon by thumping it. All the thumps sounded the same to the children, but we would agree with Papa when he said that that certain melon was a perfect ripeness. When the appropriate number of melons was selected, he would then use some of the ice to cool them down. The anticipation of the ice cream and the watermelon mounted in the minds of his children. Back to the ice cream making. Finally, the mixture was placed in the ice cream maker, and the mechanical part placed on the wooden tub and latched down for hand turning. Next, only Big Pop was allowed to pack the ice in the maker. First an inch of ice, and then a layer of salt. And this procedure would be repeated until the tub was filled to the top with ice and salt. Now for the fun part. The older boys would turn the crank. They would take turns. On the side of the tub was a small hole that would allow salt water to drain off as it melted. I was too small to turn the crank, so my job was to put my little finger in the hole from time to time to make sure it was not clogged, and the salt water would drain off and not rise to the top and get into the ice cream tumbler. Salt intrusion was a sure way to ruin the ice cream. The first casualty of the day was my finger. I took the job seriously and held my finger in the hole with the same determination as the Dutch boy who put his finger in the dike. The cold water made it numb, and I did not realize a sharp sliver of ice had cut my fingernail off until someone shouted, "The water in the ice cream maker is turning red." While I was being bandaged, my cousins kept turning the crank till Big Pop declared it was ready to set. He was the only one qualified to do this, and he carefully raked the salt from the top of the machine, removed the dasher, and repacked the tub with ice all the way to the top. His final job was to remind us not to touch the ice cream for 1 hour, and only with his supervision. Again, any salt that got into that ice cream would be disastrous. Well, I believe it was Michael, the youngest of the Texas bunch, but as soon as the adults were out of sight, helping Papa with the watermelons, Michael removed the ice and took the cover off just to get a little taste. Big mistake. The salt water floated to the fresh ice cream. He hurriedly covered it up and disappeared to some other part of the yard. At the appointed time, Big Pop announced that the ice cream should be ready. We should get our bowls and follow him. Michael stood in the background. As soon as the lid was removed, Big Pop saw what had happened. He did not attempt to identify the culprit, but the ice cream was ruined. There was no point in trying to save it, and not enough time to make another batch. So he poured the cream, ice and all, onto the salt onto the grass. Old Snyder was the family dog. He immediately tacked the concoction as if it were made for him. I suppose the salt was too much for him, and he went into convulsions, and then into what Papa called a running fit. This was the funniest things us kids had ever seen. Around the house, under the house, onto the porch, out to the barn he ran, finally collapsing near what was left of the ice cream. That 4th of July, we only had watermelon and the fun of seeing old Snyder go crazy. Soon, all the children were loaded into their respective family vehicles and headed home. I stayed, as I lived just across the road from my grandmother and grandfather. I remember that late afternoon over 60 years ago as if it were yesterday. Me and Mama in the porch swing, my head in her lap, where the smell of the sourdough biscuits from breakfast and that Southern lady perspiration still lingered on her apron. Now, with time having passed, that house, the large magnolia tree, and the swing are completely gone. It is now more or less just a vacant plot of land, much as it was before the laughter of children and grandchildren filled the air. There is little resemblance to the place where hard living was eked out to support the large family and lots of hangers-on. Mama and Papa, they're gone now. Most of the uncles and some of the grandchildren are gone. Even Cousin Michael has passed. Occasionally, however, when I go back home, I'll pass by the old home place and remember each of them. That 4th of July, the watermelons, the homemade ice cream, and old Snyder and his running fit.